welcome to AP Taylor Swift, the podcast for Swifties with English degrees, or just those who overanalyze everything. Each episode, we dive into a deep reading of Taylor Swift's lyrics to uncover the literary themes, references, and inspirations behind the songs to better understand and interpret why Taylor's songs resonate so deeply with fans. I'm Jodi, and I'm joined by Maansi and Jenn, and we are your unofficial professors of Taylor Swift. We did all the extra credit, then got graded on a curve, so now we're here to teach some lessons, whether we're qualified to or not. On today's show, we are diving into the theme of toxic relationships. Now, Taylor Swift has no shortage of songs about relationships, and in fact, she's often criticized for writing about her ex-boyfriends. But before we dive in, what exactly qualifies as a toxic relationship? Well, a quick disclaimer, none of us here are mental health professionals, and the information on this podcast today is for the sole purpose of being informative and is not considered to be complete. But according to Psychology Today, toxic relationships are based on conflict, competition, and the need to control. So whereas positive and healthy relationships are supportive and empathetic and compassionate, a toxic or a negative relationship can include signs like isolation and blame, jealousy and dishonesty, gaslighting, denial, a lack of support, a lack of compassion, just to name a few examples. And I had the benefit of spending the weekend with my dear best friend, who is also a psychologist, Dr. Abby LePage. It is still weird to call her a doctor, but she is one. And so she mentioned a few other key things about toxic relationships that I think are worth mentioning. The fact that I had a professional to talk to about this was great. First is that the word toxic might not exactly be the right word here. It's a little buzzwordy, but I think for the purposes of this conversation, it categorizes what we're trying to talk about. But just because you might not recognize a relationship with the word toxic, that doesn't mean it's not a negative relationship. Often in these relationships, you'll see someone talk less about themselves and more about what they should do or what is expected of them. So that's something to look out for in today's conversation, as well as maybe in life. There's often a lot of making excuses for the way that you feel, and also that sometimes you can't necessarily articulate what you're feeling and that something's wrong, but your unconscious will know, and it'll often manifest in physical symptoms. So sleeplessness, headaches, stomach aches, etc. I think that's that gut feeling that we all think about so often that comes up in these negative relationships. But it's also not just romantic relationships that we're talking about. A toxic relationship can be any connection that makes you feel unsupported, misunderstood, undermined, or attacked. And that can include relationships with friends, family, bosses, coworkers, you name it. So with that little dissertation, let's dive into today's show and tell episode about toxic relationships. Jenn, you want to kick us off?
My song of choice was Stay, Stay, Stay. So it is on the album Red, came out in 2012, written by Taylor Swift alone. So it was a solo writing credit for her. And it's track number 9. This song to me, I do think it is still toxic, but the more I listened and the more I thought about it, the more it really felt to me like your first love in high school, like that young first love where you're experiencing these feelings that you've never had before. She talks about you carry my groceries now and I'm always laughing. I've been loving you for quite some time. It's just very simplistic, and I can get into the reasons why it was not a good relationship. But it was making me think of those high school things of I remember in high school sort of thinking Jane Eyre was a romantic story. And then I grew up and I was like, it's absolutely not. And I feel like that's what this song is, where in the moment it felt romantic. But now looking back on it, you can see no, honey, this was not a good situation to be in. But if you're a teenager, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think if we go back to the literature that we read in high school that made us portray relationships a certain way, they were dramatic and intense. And so
yes,
I'm pretty sure we almost broke up last night. I threw my phone across the room at you. I was expecting some dramatic turn away. She was this, it starts with anger and a fight, and she was expecting the drama to escalate. I think that really speaks to how we've been conditioned to look at love or look at relationships, which I do think this is a little toxic, but I do agree with you. The more I look at it, I'm like, okay, it's not the worst, but it's a bit like, honey, we've got to talk about what a good relationship looks like. What is it? You laughed at me. You think it's funny when I'm mad? Like what? What?
Which listening to it as an adult, I was like, absolutely not. And then as I was thinking about it, and I was like, okay, it was Red. She was like in her teens when she wrote this, probably. Absolutely toxic, but
this is
still.
The same person that wrote All Too Well. So, like, that is a work of art, and it has a maturity to it that is far beyond her years. And then you balance that out with this, and I'm like, what?
Well, something that I thought was super interesting is on the album, this song comes right after We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together. So you have a song about we're never getting back together, and then a song about staying. And I feel like that was very intentional. Yes, All Too Well is a great work of art, but what this does, those two things side by side, is it's that back and forth of like, we broke up, we got back together, we broke up, got back together, and we are never ever getting back together is the moment of breakup. And I feel like Stay, Stay, Stay is the moment of like being back together when you thought you were going to break up. And they're both not mature takes on a relationship, but if I heard a 15-year-old or even 17 or 18-year-old saying these things, I'd be like, hey, that's probably not a great relationship for you. But I also wouldn't be like, you are in a like the most toxic situation you could be in. If a 30-year-old woman said this, I'd be like, no, absolutely get out. And I don't want to get into Taylor's life too much, because that is not the point of this. If her partner in these songs was significantly older, that again changes the reading for me. Because as I was reading it, thinking about like high school, it's like, yeah, I remember my high school boyfriend. We weren't this dramatic, but we were dramatic. I remember thinking like, oh, like we'll be together forever. I don't care if we fight. I don't care if we have like problems in our relationship. Like I found love for the first time and I want to keep it, and how to get to the point where I was like, okay, no, never mind. But he was also the same age as me. So that level of toxicity at like when you're both 18 is different than if there's a age gap. Just something I'm going to throw out there.
Is there anything in the text that suggests how old this person is? Just to go back to sticking to
One
the text.
thing I thought was interesting was like, you carry my groceries, which is just feels a little bit older to me of like,
or just someone,
you're doing your
those
own,
are heavy.
Well, you're doing your own grocery shopping.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
It also says you came in wearing a football helmet, though, which made me really feel like it was somebody like also potentially in high school.
Yeah, I think the same thing.
Yeah, I think your comparison to We Are Never Getting Back Together is a great one, because that song literally starts off, we called it off again last night. And the fact that these are close together, like, yes, this album, Red, has a range of songs for maturity specifically. And I think Begin Again is also on Red, right? And I think that's another more like serious, deep, powerful kind of song of like really falling in love. Whereas some of the songs are a little bit more childish and innocent. And I think that comparison to We Are Never Getting Back Together feels right. Like this feels connected to that one somehow.
I forget even when I'm listening to this song that it is on Red, because it sonically doesn't sound like the same Taylor Swift that wrote All Too Well. But then, yeah, when you bring up We Are Never Ever Getting Back Together, but that's like she needed to have her first single, and that first single was always in that.
22 was We're so Happy, good. Free, Confused, and Lonely at the same time. So I think the fact that this album is a little bit of contradictory,
it's okay.
Kind of makes sense in a way.
And it is sonically too, right? That was the criticism of this album, that it was a little all over the place because it was her transition from country to pop. And so in the same way, the music is a little of everything. The emotions are also a little of everything. The maturity level is a little of everything. She was 19, so that's not mature.
Yeah, that like it feels like a teenager wrote this to me, where like if she was still in this relationship at age, 25, it'd be like, maybe no, but like if you're a teenager, I kind of get it. It's not good. It feels like that toxic first love. It really, to me, feels like you found love for the first time and you're so excited about how it feels that you start to overlook things you shouldn't be overlooking. And then eventually you're like, oh, never mind, which we know is how, well, she is not in the same relationship she was then. So one way or another, she moved on, I think, most of us have experienced things like that.
It's almost like the phase of denial, like in between.
Yes.
It's like you're going through these lows and then you come back and you're like, oh, just kidding. Like, whatever, we can forget about it. Let's just pretend that never happened.
Yeah, and it feels really innocent. I mean, the three of us have the benefit of knowing all three songs we're going to talk about. And so as I've thought about the songs you guys are going to talk about, that's so much deeper, so much richer, it's so much more mature. So then as soon as I like thought about that and then went back to this one, it was just like it just feels really immature to me, which I think is okay.
I think the word is innocent.
Innocent's a better word. I agree.
It is like, oh, you took the time to memorize me. I just like hanging out with you all the time.
I think it's the throwing of the phone that feels immature to me, and I really have like grasped onto that line of being in a fight with someone and literally throwing your phone at them. I'd be like, okay, well.
You're right. Like, it is a time-bound thing. Like, this happens at one phase with one relationship is one thing. If it continued and became a trend in a lot of relationships, we could totally continue to call it toxic.
Or if this is the basis of this relationship and this is what happens all the time, you're like, oh, girl, let's talk. This is not someone you want to stay. And then this always reminds me of All You Had to Do Was Stay.
I had that written down too.
Track 5 on 1989, which is like the poppiest track 5 ever. But I think that's another interesting contrast. That's the next album, which, by the way, so excited for 1989 Taylor's version. It's another evolution of this is I Want You to Stay, and that one is You Didn't Stay, and all you had to do was stay.
And the only other note I have for this one too, well, 2 notes, I'm sorry. One, it kind of, there's a whole world of songs we haven't talked about, but thinking about the songs Red and Maroon, where it's one way and then it's darker when you look back on it. That's really how I felt about this song. Of like the first few times I heard it, I was like, this is fun. And the more I looked back on it, it was like, there's just those moments where, like, going back to our Wonderland conversation and past episodes, where like there's those moments where it's like, oh, this is Wonderland, it's cool. And then you're like, that feels off. And that's really how I felt about this song. Of like, would I listen to the song and be like, this is the most toxic relationship? No, but it's just like, it's just red flags. And then the only other thing that I think like that gave me that kind of innocent, doesn't, kind of new to this, is she has the line, I just like hanging out with you all the time, which is a really sweet line. But you also started the song with a massive fight you had where you threw a phone at this individual, and like, if that's the only fight you've ever had, maybe, but that to me was one of those moments where it's like, but do you actually like hanging out all the time since you had such a massive blow up fight? Which is where I got into that like young love of just back and forth, quick fight, quick heady love. So interesting song, but we can move on to.
One thing that I wanted to just add as you were saying that is we talk about often the difference between what the lyrics are saying and what the music is saying. Or maybe sometimes they're the same, but they kind of go together. Like, there's 2 parts of every song. There's the lyrics and then there's the whole kind of like feel of it. And I agree that when we look at the lyrics by themselves, they seem a little questionable, like raise your eyebrows. One thing about the music is also like she has a giggle in the song, like she's laughing.
Very upbeat.
And so in terms of how she was intending it to be taken, it feels like she wanted it to be taken in a lighthearted way.
Oh, Taylor, cool. Young Taylor.
That was one of my surprise songs at the Eras tour. So cool that we got to talk about it. I chose the song Tolerate It, which dials it up a few notches.
Big pivot.
Just a few.
And this happens to be the 5th song on Evermore, which was already kind of a depressing album, but let's just go ahead and talk about the most depressing song on the most depressing album. It is, I mean, like all of the songs on this album, just a beautifully written song. The music is beautiful. The lyrics are beautiful. It was written by Taylor Swift and Aaron Dessner. And I think it qualifies as a toxic relationship based on your earlier definition, Jodi, based on like a lack of support, emotional support, almost like an emptiness in feeling between 2 people. Like where on one hand, you talk about a healthy relationship as being passionate and celebratory. This is very much like passive, the absence of a lot of those emotions. And in many instances, it feels like the woman, the speaker, is just almost like a servant, like in servitude of her partner. So
yeah, it's very about the other person.
It really is. The reason that this song came to my head, the second that we said toxic relationships, was because it has always reminded me of marriage, but specifically, I feel like I always got vibes of like the marriages in our parents' generations or our grandparents' generations, like generations past the institute of marriage and what it used to be in society, maybe a little less of what it is now, although I'm sure this kind of relationship definitely still exists. But it feels like these days marriages tend to be more balanced, or their ideal is like something more balanced where the man and woman have kind of balanced roles to play in a relationship. And this song feels very one-sided, where the woman is almost literally waiting on her husband. There's all these lyrics like, sit and watch you read, sit and watch you breathe, sit and watch you. You're so much older and wiser. Wait by the door. Use my best colors for your portrait. First of all, she's painting a portrait, so there's that. Lay the table with the fancy shit. Greet you with a battle hero's welcome. Polish plates until they gleam and glisten. Like, this is a woman who is at home and is basically constantly waiting around her significant other, who happens to be significantly older. And that disbalance is kind of what threw me into potentially a different time, even though certainly that still happens today. I know it used to be a lot more common.
Well, even the you were out building other worlds, where was I? To me, that's like, I guess it goes with the other. We get this sense that she is in the domestic sphere, she is inside, and he goes out and works and
Right.
lives a life, and that is not as common now.
And she waits
thankfully.
by the door to greet him. Right.
Like
yeah.
a kid. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
It really reminds me of Mad Men, season 1 Mad Men.
And we know
Yes.
she likes Mad Men.
We do know that. But like literally the first, have you guys seen Mad Men?
Oh, yes.
I have.
Okay, wasn't sure where you guys have been. But so the very first episode, you have Don Draper living his life in New York City, like being with a woman, doing whatever. And then it's a shocking ending because he comes home and you find out he's married and he has a wife and a family in the suburbs. And there's nothing in the episode that like really indicates that. It has been a long time since I've seen it, so sorry if I'm not.
I don't even know how you remember that first. I'm like, that was impressive.
Side note to all of that, this era of like feminism is really interesting to me. So Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique has always been just like really fascinating, of how long it took us in society to have someone sit down and be like, maybe women don't want to do this. If you do, that's cool. But like, maybe this isn't the most fulfilling life, or like maybe women can do more. I just feel like we took so long to get there. So that's always been, really interesting to me. And that, like this is all, again, definitely very The Feminine Mystique, where it's like women can have lives. They have inner lives. They have things they want to do, the way they can think. And it also makes me think of The Edible Woman by Margaret Atwood, which is a really fascinating read as well. But in Mad Men, she literally, the whole first season is her just like desperately waiting for him, being bored out of her mind, wanting him to come home, because her whole life revolves around him. And then obviously Betty takes a very interesting character arc in the show, which is fun to see. But this really reminds me of like that first season of her perspective.
And I think that was the generation that kind of I had in my head too, a slightly like older generation. I do think the song is applicable to relationships today, but I was thinking more of like our parents and our grandparents kind of eras, where it was not always given that mothers, grandmothers would work. They would stay home. They would kind of like look after the fathers. And it literally, some characters that I thought of, I was really reminded of Virginia Woolf, who Virginia Woolf herself, the author, happened to have a very amazing relationship with her husband, a very passionate, equal kind of love at her era. But she writes often about these other female characters like Clarissa Dalloway, like Mrs. Ramsey from To the Lighthouse. And I was kind of reminded, especially when it was polishing the plates till they gleam and glisten, I was kind of reminded, I had like this like flashback of some of these female characters that
I almost mentioned Mrs. Dalloway.
And in To the Lighthouse too, kind of like, To the Lighthouse has a scene where the husband and wife actually talk about the love that's like fizzled away in their relationship, which is a very powerful scene. But yes, in Mrs. Dalloway, there's this other man that she had a love for, and then there's her husband that she like feels nothing for. And yeah, so it is definitely a toxic relationship in that sense. There's a big disbalance between the gender roles. One thing that I do think is interesting is that the speaker is a little bit enlightened. She keeps saying that I feel like my love should be celebrated.
I know my love should be celebrated.
I know my love should be celebrated, but you tolerate it. And so it's not just her sitting in the wayside kind of wanting to be celebrated. She knows that she's being treated not right.
And the whole bridge is, well, what if I did something about it? Like right now I'm a footnote in your life. What if I left? What if I just, broke free? You didn't mention it. Has anyone read Rebecca? Because my understanding is that this was inspired by Rebecca. I have not read it.
I have not read it.
I would argue that there's like a whole genre of literature that is like Rebecca-esque, like a lot, Mrs. Dalloway, The Awakening, all of that kind of stuff.
I only started listening to it this morning because that's when I was able to get it from the library. And I'm literally 8 minutes into the book and it has such Evermore vibes. It talks about Ivy and the woods. And I was like, oh yeah. And so I feel like I'm excited to continue reading it because it is Evermore.
Make that album make a lot of sense. Yeah.
We definitely need a book club.
I mean, we've already read Alice in Wonderland. I feel like we can
just keep going.
Yeah.
Well, and one thing here also is, I think on that part, you were talking about the bridge, is she says, believe me, I can do it. So I think there's sometimes where if we're going into this historical timeline of when women played this kind of a role, maybe more often, or when these relationships were more common, I think oftentimes women were told to tolerate it. There was this expectation that women were told that like your husband might not be like the Prince Charming of your dreams or whatever. It's fine. That's not real life. Just deal with it, like we all have, like every generation before has dealt with it. And I love the fact that she does have this like awakening. And so it feels like a transitional maybe of like, this has been done this way for generations, but I actually know that it's wrong and I could change it. And we're on this like cusp, this like in between generation. So anyways, I thought that was interesting. Beautiful song and very,
it's a stunning song.
Very emotional.
And can we talk about how it was staged at the Eras tour? Because it was like a play. I guess I'd make it a musical, but it was beautiful staging. Seeing that distance, literal physical distance between the two play out, where he's on one end of the stage and she's on the other singing, seeing her physically set the table, but then seeing her throw it all away and stand on the table and assume some agency over her life. Does she do it? I don't know. But it was really, I was surprised to see it in the show. It did not seem to fit with stadium tour, but she did it justice as obviously she could. And it was incredible.
Yeah, I do think this is one of those that came to life exactly how you kind of imagine it in your head. And it's because the lyrics are just so beautifully well written that I think everyone kind of has the same image in their head. The point that I brought up earlier about stay, 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 about the lyrics saying one thing and like what's the tone or like how is she singing it? How is the music? I did have this question of whether you all think that there is actual resentment or anger in this song or whether she's just kind of defeated and resigned, because the bridge is quite powerful, but when I was listening to it, it didn't at all sound scornful to me.
To me, it feels, I'm going to use the word desperate, and I don't think that's the word I want, but we're going to stick with it until I possibly find a new word. But thinking about the lines, if it's all in my head, tell me now, tell me I've got it wrong somehow. So she's being honest, but it's like this to me is like her Hail Mary of like, this is what's happening. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm misreading this. Like this, she doesn't want to be this way. She wants it to be more. Where's that man who threw blankets over my barbed wire? So like, I can't think of a better word than it, but it doesn't feel resentful to me. It feels like this is my last hope of I'm going to like throw this out there and I'm desperately hoping that you're going to say, I'm so sorry. I had no idea and that this can be resolved. Like, she's saying, I can leave, but tell me I've got it wrong somehow. Like, I don't think she quite wants to. She's not done. She's not angry enough to be done with it yet.
I feel like she's been to a lot of therapy, the speaker, maybe not Taylor, well, Taylor too, but a lot of therapy. And it's like, you gotta tell the dude, her therapist, I can see her saying, like, you gotta tell this guy what this situation is actually like, that you are watching him and noticing him and you're waiting for him and you do everything for him and he does nothing. He just tolerates you. You have to tell him how you feel. And so I think there's this element of like, I'm trying not to lose my shit as I tell you this, but you need to know what the situation is really like for me. And so, and then by the bridge, when she's like, I could do it, believe me, I think that's when she is like, you know what? I'm serious. I could leave, like, shape up or ship out.
Yeah, I love both of those. I kind of agree. I think it is like a let you know I'm desperate to be heard. But that's where I was like, it almost does feel like a last resort. Like she's almost kind of defeated, like out of energy, like through fighting, like just really wants to be heard. But I also get the sense that she still really loves this man. Like she wants to be celebrated. Like she has so much love for him that she thinks it should be something. I love that line that I know my love should be celebrated. It's
empowering.
She still really, really loves this man, and she's just sad that all of that love is going to waste.
I think that's a moment of self-empowerment that like my love should be celebrated and you're just going to tolerate it. And that's not okay. I'm not going to tolerate that. I'm not going to tolerate being tolerated. I need to be celebrated. And again, I think that's a really empowering thing to say and to recognize that, different from stay, where it's like, you think it's funny when I'm mad, but you carry my groceries, so it's okay. This is like, no, actually, like, I have expectations now. I'm adult. I have expectations for the way I should be loved. You're not meeting them. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I feel like this is like almost somewhat healing for me. Side story, bragging about my spouse. Several years ago for Christmas, Chris came to me and he was like, I don't know. He was like, I want to be more educated in the world of feminism. Give me a list of like the 10 cornerstone feminist books that I should read. And I was like, done. And that was like we don't do gifts for Christmas. We do like, I'm going to do this for you this year. And so that was his gift, was I want to like learn more. Can you help me? And I was like, yes. And so I was going through and I was making this list and I was realizing so many of the early ones, The Awakening, Madame Bovary, some of those kinds of things drove me insane because they're this situation, but the woman just kind of like usually dies at the end. And I understand that for like what was happening then, it was just this like, we need to get this narrative out here that like sometimes women are it was just creating this whole new way of looking at women, which is super important. But like modern me would get like outraged with it and was just like, just, I don't know, just kill him and leave. I don't know. Like, I know that's not a real option, but I would just be outraged. And so going through that list for Chris, I was like getting angry again. And it's like something that's like always been like, man, I like hadn't noticed that pattern until then. And this song for me was like actually kind of healing because it's taking that same narrative, but then it is putting a little bit of agency back into it, saying like, I will leave, I will go, I'm going to commute. It's like kind of trying, to me, it feels like it's like retaking it, which I find to be very powerful and healing for all of that.
The topic of agency is a very hot topic right at this moment because I think there is a desire to want to rewrite a lot of old narratives with a different angle. But that in doing that, you're actually downplaying what agency those women had at that time. They may not have had much agency, but they were just trying to express what they could at that moment. And it's like always understanding that agency has grown over time. At that point, they were using what agency they had. And over time, that changes. I know in the media the last few days, there's been the topic of Snow White and how Snow White is going to be, I don't know, have you guys heard this?
No.
They're making a Snow White live action. And there's been all this talk about how, well, Snow White is not just going to sit around for the prince. And this time she's a superwoman and she's going to like save the world and, I don't know, be a boss. And everybody's like, but what if Snow White didn't want to be a boss? Like, why are we making every woman a boss? Why can't we just respect that some women don't want that and they still deserve to be happy? And I think in this song, especially, it's one of those, like, the fact that she recognizes she deserves to be celebrated is enough. She doesn't need to go out and get a job and save the world and go outside. Like, she can continue doing everything and painting portraits of her husband.
But be celebrated.
All she wants is that to be celebrated.
That's so much to ask.
Yeah, like, it's just, she's like, I'm not trying to like go out here and change the world. I love you a ton and I want that to be recognized. And I think that I love that about this song, is that it feels like there's agency here without it being just completely rewriting those kind of narratives.
Yeah, it's taking it and putting in a little bit of agency, but it's not turning it into something completely different. It's okay to want to be loved by your spouse. That's actually a really reasonable thing to want in life.
Well, on that super depressing note.
Yeah, right.
So I've got the last song in our show and tell. It's another Evermore special. It's Time to Go. This was on Evermore, track 17. It was a bonus track, so it might be something that many people haven't actually listened to regularly. Written by Taylor Swift and Aaron Dessner. What I like about this song, in particular as it relates to this topic of toxic relationships, is that it talks about more than just a romantic relationship. It brings in lots of different types of relationship, friendship, work, colleagues. And I think it does a beautiful job of bringing up those different types of relationships. So there is something for everybody to resonate with. So from the dinner's cold, the chatter's old, you ask for the tab, like, oh, this is just kind of stale, to something that is a bit more gaslighting, like he's insisting that friends look at each other like that. Or maybe there's betrayal from a friend when the words of a sister come back in whispers that prove that she's not what it seemed. That there is something in each of these little vignettes that will resonate with somebody out there. Maybe you haven't had, a toxic romantic relationship, but maybe you've had a friend betray you. And I think she does that because when you get to, I don't know what it's called, it's not the bridge, but it's another verse. She talks about you, right? This is the first couple of verses are when you ask for the tab, it's about somebody else. It's 20 years at your job. And then she gets to herself. 15 years, 15 million tears, begging till my knees bled. I gave it my all. He gave me nothing at all, then wondered why I left. Now, if you are a Taylor Swift professor junkie like we are, you know that this is referring to Scott Borchetta not giving her the rights to her masters. She spent 15 years at Big Machine Records, and then he wouldn't give her her masters, and so she left. That's a very specific and personal thing to Taylor. That is not something that most people can relate to. And I think what I like about Taylor Swift's writing is that it is something that everybody can relate to. So here's this point in this song that is very much just about her. But I think that she, in pulling in all these little vignettes about very different situations in the beginning of the song, she's giving everybody something that will something in there will resonate with you, so that by the time it gets to what happened to her, you're like, oh, that hurts. I feel that. That didn't happen to me, but I can empathize. I know what that situation is like. I don't want to go too much deeper because I know we're going to deep dive into this one. But the other thing that came up for me here that resonated with what my friend Abby had said was how toxic relationships, sometimes you don't recognize it first consciously, you recognize it unconsciously. It's about your gut feelings. And the chorus is that old familiar body ache, the snaps from the same little breaks in your soul. You know when it's time to go. That's the part of the song that gets me every time.
So this is connected, but connection I just literally made right now, talking about that now 15 years, 15 million tears, and it goes down to he's got my past frozen behind glass, and the I Can See You music video.
Connected. Or the way that it showed, or look what you made me do in the Eras tour.
Yes.
Also behind glass.
Same vibe. Yeah.
Same vibe.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts about this, and I know we're going to deep dive. One thing that I thought was cool with all of these different situations that she presents here, I feel it feels very Big Sister to me, which may or may not be the right take, but it kind of feels like Big Sister saying, like, you can leave. You don't have to tough it out. Like, it's okay. Like, and here's all these situations, and guess what? Like, there's a lot of ways in life that sometimes you can go. Giving up is a strong thing. Sometimes to run is the brave thing. It just feels very like Big Sisterly, like, take care of yourself. It's okay.
I love that particular lyric. Just sometimes giving up is a strong thing. And to your point, Jodi, about how we're coming out of a very personal thing that is only unique to Taylor, but then you get to these lyrics and this is like something that just repeats throughout the song, and everybody has these moments where they're like, I can't do it anymore. Like, I don't have the energy to face this. And I love that is kind of like the lyric that repeats over and over again, because she kind of takes you on this journey from the universal to the very specific. And then you have this aha moment of like, what is it that she's talking about? But you also can kind of make it your own anthem. And in terms of how she makes songs universal, like, here's a great example.
Yes, this is a great way, because I think there's a lot in her more recent music that is about this particular situation of not being able to own her own masters. And that's not something that we all can relate to. So the way that she makes those connections, Mad Woman, vigilante shit, Karma, right? Those are all songs that are about this theme, that are essentially about her work. Like, this is a workplace, this is a toxic work relationship. And she finds a way to make it super relatable.
Yeah, well, I had one more note that I thought is more thematic that maybe we can address here, which is the song came out in 2020 at a time when all of us were trapped at home. And do you all remember the Great Resignation? Like, this feeling that everyone was saying about work. The first time I heard this song, I remember just like being like, oh my God, she's done it again. Like, first of all, this entire album is like such a pandemic album that in so many ways like really captured the heart of what we were going through as a society. But this song in particular, I think there was this general fatigue where everybody was like exhausted and done with the BS. And everyone was like, why are we still doing this? And talk about like being able to relate to somebody that you could never relate to. Like, this song definitely, like, I heard and I was like, oh my God, it's about getting out of that toxic.
I think on that note, like, the other thing that I think the pandemic did for a lot of people was force you to reevaluate your relationships, because you know, life is precious and you wanted to remember and reconnect with the people who mean something to you, and the people who don't mean something to you are probably not people that you need to have in your life. And I think that this is another thing that this song does to me, is like, makes me think about that like, if something is not serving you and it doesn't feel good, it's time to go. You don't have to have it as part of your life. I also think that's a very adult perspective and very different than stay to it's time to go, right? You don't have to stay. And there might be little things that do work for you, but if in your gut, this doesn't feel right, and there are things that are telling you this is not right, it's time to go.
Yeah, I think, sorry, we could talk about all this forever. I'm so sorry. But the thing I was thinking about too, and
That's
stay,
why we have a podcast.
I know, right? And stay. She says, you gave me no choice but to stay, which I don't read that as like he's like forcing her in this relationship or anything, but just kind of a like, oh, I have no choice. I have to stay. We're so in love. Versus this, which you get, you know, when it's time to go. So I thought that was interesting, where in stay, it's external. You have given me no choice to stay. And then we get into this song and it's internal of, you know, when it's time to go. Trust yourself.
That also brings me to Tolerate It. I feel like, sorry, I know we're jumping all over the place, but that's the point of a show and tell. Tolerate It. She always says you tolerate it. But what I want to know is, does she have to tolerate it? Like, that, because it sounds like in that song, she's like, I don't have to tolerate it. And guess what? Maybe it's time to go.
Yeah.
What an evolution. What a connection between these songs.
The order of these songs worked out very well.
Yeah. There's quite an arc there. Amazing.
I love it. Well, I think it's time for us to go. that is all we have for you today on AP Taylor Swift. Be sure to rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. Follow us on your favorite social channel at AP Taylor Swift to stay up to date. And join us next time as we overanalyze and deep dive into It's Time to Go on AP Taylor Swift.